Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who has something important to tell me at the top of the village.
Tim Longo.
Is it that there's more to life than what meets the eye?
I do know that squares are good, but cubes are bad.
To keep those devil squares away. We are about to start a new. Some folks may already know what we're about to talk about, but we're about to start a new latest entry as well, I believe, in our latest on our timeline in our discussions of games at this point. But we should probably, introduce the broader topic first, and that is, and I want you to kind of take the floor here, but it's let's do some indie games. So can you kind of start with why are we doing some indie games from your perspective? I've been playing more of them and longer than you have, as we were talking in pre-show, but I'm kind of curious why. I mean, possibly it's just, I got to fill these gaps in, but let me know.
Yeah, no, there is a strategy to it for me. It's something that I think I probably mentioned either on air or in Discord or something from time to time. That because to say some very obvious things, I guess, because the podcast is about what it is about. And a lot of things have emerged for us over time that we didn't really expect, because I don't think we really had a real plan coming into this. But because
narrator, we still don't have a real plan.
we have no real macro plan, but sometimes we have tiny little mini plans like this one. But yeah, some of it is a little bit, 9 years later, it's maybe time, but also indie games in the traditional, I guess, definition of them, or especially ones that call themselves indie games, which is, it can get tricky sometimes depending on, in some cases where publishers are getting involved. But anyway, they've always been a blind spot for me. And, obviously I know it's a blind spot, and I've always felt, to be honest, guilt over some of the classic indie games that I really should have played. But also knowing that, so some of it is selfish and wanting to, to kind of hit this topic. But the more important part of it, for me suggesting it, is that if this podcast is about looking at games from the past and then looking at their impact today, I don't know if there's a better category to talk about than, sort of, I say classic indie games, which doesn't go back to the 80s and 90s, right? Really. I'm talking about the era where indie games were really coined and became more of a real sustainable business, because of all sorts of reasons. We'll talk about digital platforms being maybe the main one, and kind of unleashing this ability for developers to not have to do things the way that we've always had to. And a lot of the stuff we talk about on the podcast, obviously every game we've talked about almost, some of the older ones that go way back when the industry was so tiny, it's kind of were indie games in a way.
Right. But, there was no publishing model to support that. I mean, from that perspective, my first games were indie games because they were freely distributed on,
right, exactly.
Via, the DARPANET or whatever, the ARPANET, the precursor of the internet. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, well, and again, we can pick out even early, Will Wright games.
Sure,
So technicality is aside, I'm really talking about the quote unquote in earnest indie revolution, I would say, kind of,
right.
So it felt like a blind spot. We haven't really hit. We've talked a lot about publisher influence on games, and every time we start a new series, we talk about the publisher of that series and what status they were in, and we try to, at least our memories. And then all the guests we've had on have been in that same category. But it felt to me and especially inspired by the charity event, which I brought up before, because the streamers that the charity event organizers have gotten, have played indie games. We've talked about them, and they have had, it's sort of now become this sort of circular influence where it's like the games, especially the one we're going to talk about now, have been influenced by the classic games we've talked about over the course of these 9 years. But the indie games are now almost starting to influence, bigger games or more traditional games. And there's this interesting mixture now, in my opinion, from a day job perspective. There's been this interesting kind of meshing, if you will, going on. So yeah, it just felt like a blind spot, felt like an important category to hit. It's a blind spot for me for sure as a gamer, and a lot of that is just because I think I've always felt this pressure to stay up on the games that are in the space that I work. So the big box, big budget kind of stuff. I do enjoy them, but and I've always felt like why, and so I'm kind of on this just in my free time. I've been on this indie game kick. And it felt like there were some classic ones from the aughts and the early tens that we should play.
Absolutely. And so we're going to start off by, like I said, extending beyond the sort of existing range of the podcast into kind of the square middle of, and one of the more publicized games of the time because of its inclusion in the indie game the movie documentary, which is Fez, by the small company Polytron, but mostly associated with its principal designer, Phil Fish. So a little bit of a controversial figure. We might get to that, probably not a ton. It's not really what the podcast is about. But he was always kind of a sort of flashpoint kind of guy. He was a trash talker in all kinds of forums, and would tell people why X game was terrible and Y game was terrible, and et cetera, et cetera. He really kind of built up a very opinion forward reputation. In the meantime, he was I'm going to go off and make a game that people will really talk about. That's what games really should be, sort of guy. And I would argue that he did. I do. I will put my opinion on my sleeve and say I think this is one of the best games ever made. And we'll talk about why. I'm already feeling the tug into it, because it was a game that I played this in 2014 at a time when I was basically recovering from burnout, frankly, and I wasn't working. I think I was maybe about to teach, and over the summer I was just playing a lot of games that I knew about and wanted to catch up with, and Fez was one of them. And I spent 2 weeks doing nothing but Fez, and puzzling out all its many delights on my own. I'm gonna look and see if I think I had a notebook at the time, because there's a lot of like taking notes as you play, or there can be if you're trying to figure out and find all the cubes, which I did back then. So we shall see if I try to do that again. I probably won't finish it in the course of the podcast because I'm playing some other things as well. But I might just keep playing it until I've done it all again. I did look. I have the platinum trophy for this one, and I can't get it again, unfortunately. So I'm.
You can spiritually.
I was hoping that I had actually played it on like the Xbox, like the 360, so that I could. But no, alas, I had played it on my PS3 at the time. So
yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, well, let's talk a little bit about 2012 in video games. I'm going to split it kind of in two halves. One is the big box or the big budget games that Tim was talking about, and the other is the indies, to give you a flavor kind of what was going on in indie space at the time. So in the AAA space, we've got Dishonored, Halo 4, Alan Wake's American Nightmare, which we mentioned because of its connection to the cast. XCOM, the reboot, I guess you'd say, from Firaxis. Mass Effect 3, everybody loved that ending, I guess. Forza Horizon, Far Cry 3, Counter-Strike Go, Assassin's Creed 3, Borderlands 2, Diablo 3. A lot of threes and fours
A
here,
lot of sequels.
and Dragon's Dogma, which I mentioned because it's another one that has a place in my heart. It was a lot of fun, and it's one of these days I'll get around to Dragon's Dogma 2. But in the indie space, we have Journey, which is another one that might be one we consider. Any of these would be worth playing, honestly, from this list. The Walking Dead, which was hugely influential, even though it wasn't Telltale's first game, is definitely the one that broke out in a major way.
Oh
FTL,
yeah.
which was a sort of rogue light, I think would be the terminology. Spelunky, or a run-based game, I guess you could just say. Spelunky, another one that's close to my heart. Papo.io, which was a heart-rending game that I played back around the same time. Bastion, which I played on iOS on my first iPad, I believe. And Super Hexagon, which was a Terry Kavanagh game. So Bastion, of course, is by what's their name? Super Giant?
Supergiant.
Yeah. That does like Hades and Transistor and of course Bastion. So well known, and they've got Hades 2 on the horizon. I guess it's in early access already, so they're still going strong. And Spelunky, they just came out with UFO 50. That's Derek Yu. That came out this year. Papo.io, I don't know that. I think that was a one and done kind of studio. Telltale, of course, is no longer with us. That game company for Journey, I think they're still around, but they're not hyper active. I think they had something out last year though.
Well, the Sky game, which is like
Yeah,
this mobile social kind of game that I think
experiment. Yeah.
is apparently doing quite well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, over time it's kind of like the slow and low kind of
Mm-hmm.
approach, but it's very different, I think, from the rest of their stuff because it's much more social and less mechanics, I think.
Oh, okay.
I only played it in when it first came out, and I think it was like very bare bones, and I think it's a lot more fleshed out. But I've heard they're like devoted everything to that game because it's like a live game.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, their Journey was also a live game, but not in nearly the same way. So it's one we can talk about.
Yeah,
You
and
and
that
I
one's
about
tricky
whether
for me because it was published by Sony, right?
it was, yeah.
Yeah. That's
They,
it's interesting to talk about indie games that
right.
are published, by the platform holders.
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel like they purchased them at some point, but I don't know if it was until after. I don't recall if it was before or after Journey. So it would definitely be one that we'd have to research a little bit more because I don't remember. But anyway, yeah. So it was a good year for, like, you see the the difference in the 2s and 3s and 4s versus the all these titles that just have very different feeling to each of them.
Well, I
That
think
some of the ones we've talked
that's an
about here.
important point too, because and we talk about it from time and time again, and to be honest, I would say we're living through it right now as well, where when the big budget holders are risk averse, they fall back on established IPs, sequels. They don't do anything that's risky. They
Right.
don't spend money on anything. And so there's a vacuum that's created at that point. And this is a great year where you see indie games step up and not be afraid to take risks. And the ones that were able to break out, like Fez or what have you, fill that void and can succeed in in the face of Borderlands 2, or
Right.
whatever, Halo 4. It's like, yeah. I think it's just a really I don't know if it's being too dramatic, but sort of the democratization of being able to make games and bring them to market differently than the 80s and 90s, um, and even early aughts to some degree. Even though we might play at least one that goes back a little ways. Um,
The other thing that I would note, in these all these kind of the twos and threes, et cetera, is that we were late in a console cycle in 2012.
yeah, yeah.
Um, the PS3 would come out in 2013. I don't remember if the Xbox One came out in advance. PS4 rather. I don't remember where the Xbox One came out relative to that. It might have been the same
I think it was
year.
the
It might have been
same year.
earlier. Yeah, it might have been earlier in the year, like May or something like. I remember there was a whole that was a
They're
whole thing with the discs, and you're gonna
always
need an
online, and
always
I was
online
there. Yeah, I
connection.
was at
Yeah,
Microsoft when the
yeah.
Xbox One came out. It
When
was
that happened, bit of a
bit of a
thing.
fiasco.
Yeah. Actually, no, I remember it didn't come out in May. It was like they made their E3 announcement, and people were like, "You're gonna do what?" Was
Right,
basically,
right. That's what it
um,
was. Yeah.
yeah. But the point being though is that when you are late in a cycle like this, and Dishonored to some degree kind of stands out because it was kind of a new sort of deal for them, although it had been in development for a while. You are seeing lots of things that are cashing in on an engine that they've built for the current generation of consoles, right? So Far Cry 3, is, I mean, they probably were working off of a different another iteration of their Ubisoft Far Cry engine, but Far Cry 2 had also been on the PS3 and the Xbox 360. There was so Assassin's Creed 3. I'm pretty sure AC2, the whole series was on PS3. I don't recall Borderlands. That might go back to the prior generation, but and Diablo 3 is kind of a special case because they were kind of returning to it after a while. Is my recollection, right? Because Diablo 2 goes back into the
Yeah, there
late
was a big
late
gap
90s or
there.
something. Yeah.
Yeah. And it
So
was obviously 3 was the big shift to 3D.
yeah,
So it
yeah.
was a big kind of sort of like a soft reboot in a way.
Yeah, and consoles, right? And which was
Hmm.
not something they had done, I don't think, at all before. So it was kind of a big swing for them, and did not have the greatest launch either, for that matter.
Yeah. The consoles I think came later, but yeah, but the launch was, yeah, they were trying to, because of Diablo 2, they were trying to do some pretty wacky things with the business.
Yeah. So what had kind of enabled all this switch, to indies was a few things. One was, it was, a time where you could now publish, kind of independently on PC. Like, it was like $100 or something to pay Steam to get on the storefront. I think they might have still been doing approvals at the time, and so something like the Indie Games Festival or other um, sort of awards ceremony. I remember like the IGF, the Independent Games Festival. Like one of the big deals was that the award winners would go on Steam, like they were approved. And so that was kind of a big deal at the time. All of that has certainly changed since, and now it's you could I have gone to a talk at GDC where somebody explained how they generated 1 billion slot machine games and automatically submitted them to stores so that they could optimize their game design. Literally generating a whole game, every time they wanted to turn the key to do that, and they had automated every step of it. It was wild. Basically A/B testing on a huge scale to find what resonated with people. Like they were pulling art from the internet. It was wild. I can't believe they got away with that, honestly. Um, but digital distribution and lowering the barriers really, really opened the doors for this. Of course, that goes back to 2005. But at this point, XBLA had been a thing. They had really invested heavily in this kind of smaller. Microsoft had kind of invested heavily, and then Sony kind of followed after. And so those storefronts also became more open to smaller scale development, because it was kind of there was a little bit of cachet, honestly. I don't, maybe you can speak to it kind of broadly, without going into details because you were there around that time. But that's my recollection. It was like kind of a thing for the console manufacturers to be like, oh yeah, hey, we also are supporting this, this kind of new, I
Xbox
don't know,
Live Arcade kind of stuff,
Xbox
you
Live
mean?
Arcade. Yeah, I was
Yeah,
thinking specifically, but
yeah,
like I said, Sony followed.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there was what was it? I mean, one that we probably aren't going to play, but Braid was a quote unquote indie game as well in the movie as well. I think,
Yes,
which
it was. Yeah,
I haven't seen the indie game, the movie or whatever it's
yeah.
called.
The third one is Super Meat Boy. Those are the three games
Right,
that
right,
are.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah, but there were these bets placed within the digital platform movement, and I would say Xbox Live Arcade was, to my memory, and I was coming in kind of in the middle of that when I started there. It was seen as a trailblazer. I would say at the time of
yeah,
like, oh, okay, a first party. Even Nintendo wasn't doing a lot of it. Everyone was doing some types of games like this, but it wasn't really a big deal. And then they had so many successes. I believe even didn't they do a relaunch of Symphony of the Night in Xbox
they
Live
did. Yeah,
Arcade?
yeah, they did.
Right. So they were taking these games that were much more focused and I don't know, indie slash retro even, and being clever about their launches.
Yeah,
Limbo
and
is another one.
originally they had a small footprint as well, which was part of it. Is that because
Yeah,
they were
even
sort of,
limitations, right?
yeah,
It's like, remember the big fiasco of like you had to be a certain megabytes
yeah,
or
like 50
gigabytes.
meg or something like that.
Yeah.
It was tiny compared to the big budget games. It was tiny, right? And I think there was also kind of a, I mean, that felt like a sort of, I'd almost say a defensive maneuver on the part of the console holders, because it's like, well, hey, you big companies, you don't have to worry about this, right? Because the people who want those really big games, like, this isn't going to compete. But it was also a technical, issue, because at the time broadband was not as well established. Of course, that was something that Microsoft probably should have learned for the Xbox One, marketing. Um, that it was just kind of a, it was still, and there's still a lot of places in the United States where broadband is still not a thing, which is kind of horrendous to think about at this stage. But so they were actually thinking about things like that as well, which is like, um, you can't expect to download 4 gigs of stuff, over a modem. But 50 meg, maybe leave it running
Mm,
for a while. So there were some some issues like that that could be uh, planned, and it it wasn't a big hit to them for servers, like the bandwidth costs they could just kind of eat, and not worry about as well, right? So that there wasn't a charge, to the things that they put up there. I remember too, behind the scenes a little bit, it was a really decent deal for developers at the time who were on Xbox Live Arcade, and the Sony equivalent, because they got a pretty good deal, and they got a fair amount of free publicity because Xbox was trying to push the service.
yeah.
And Sony, like I said, they were basically following on all this stuff. I keep saying and Sony because they were kind of following the leader, and Xbox really was trailblazing, and Microsoft was really trailblazing in this area and investing, in developers. So it was kind of a big deal. I mean, they were helping out, and if you came out on Xbox Live, in Summer of Arcade, right, you were gonna, each week they were gonna have something they were featuring,
Yeah, it
and you
was.
would be on the front page, right, of Xbox Live,
Yep. Yep.
that day. So
It
it
was
was a
very
good.
much a like watch, they would announce each week and
Yep.
you'd wait for it, and there was always like, I forget what they called it, but I think there was always like the sort of like showcase game for the summer too.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They would lead in with each week, and then like Braid was it for one year, and then after that one did so well, they started doing that every summer for a while. Yeah, Summer of
Yeah.
Arcade. That
Yep.
brings some
Yep, it was pretty.
vivid memory.
It was a whole thing. And eventually they did loosen up restrictions. Of course, now digital distribution is possible. Back then, it was like, well, are you gonna? It was a big deal for like these indie games to get a box release, and now it's kind of like, well, why would you do that? We've kind
Yeah,
of flipped the script on some things like that, but at the time, it was a really big deal. And I think some of these games still probably got later physical releases just kind of as a boutique thing. I know that there's a particular publisher who does physical releases, like short, small runs, of some of these games. So it's I don't know if Fez ever got one, or if any of the ones I mentioned got one, but it was definitely a thing for a while.
Well, I did notice that there was a Switch version that came out in 2021. So I'm wondering if that got a
Physical release.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. One of the other ones we're considering playing got a physical release. I mean, it was a lot cheaper to just put it on one of those carts because the cost of goods was low.
Yeah.
Cost of goods were also low for DVDs, but the bigger thing is just, is it going to be out there in the retail channels? And that was another thing that, that the big publishers also had to kind of contend with, was the still sizable power of retail, and not, so this was another way that they were kind of saying, they were kind of going to retail and saying, well, we're making these small things here, digitally available and only digitally available, but they're really not going to cut into your market, which was another thing that they had to negotiate at the time. And then still, that is switched now. It's not kind of a big deal anymore. Those places are struggling, or it's just a small part of a much larger business at something like like a Best Buy or a Walmart. If Best Buy is even still with us. Anyway.
Yeah, it is.
Technically. I know the one here closed. That's why I'm kind of like, well, I don't even know if did they all close, or is it just that one? So it's or just a handful or whatever. So yeah, so everything's kind of changed a lot since 2012. But it was a kind of, a high point. Fez was the last of those three games, I believe, to come out. And I would say the best of the three from the film, in my opinion. But enough wearing the game on my sleeve, or my feelings for the game on my sleeve. Let's start talking about the game proper. You should start off, because this is your first time playing. We didn't play a ton. I played less than you did because I knew I'd be able to catch up, and I didn't want to get too far ahead or get too sucked in. But yeah,
I am a little worried that because I'm not generally good at these kinds of games, because of the puzzly aspects. So
good games, you mean?
Yeah, good games, right? Yeah, sure, okay. But but so we'll see. Hopefully I can. I definitely have been hooked. I wanted to read the description I'm seeing here online. Fez is a 2-dimensional puzzle platform game set in a 3-dimensional world. That's amazing. That is like, huh? Like, even that description is like, wait, why would you do that? And then, of course, the aha moment. I'm sure everyone listening knows the aha moment, but yeah, even in your intro, you allude to it. So yeah, I came into this game roughly understanding that you can pivot the world, but I didn't really know what that meant. I don't even think I've never even seen a video of it, right? I've just had people kind of describe it. I remember when you played it back in the day. And I knew the style, right? And I knew that it was influenced by, we talked about in pre-show, it's got a little Zelda, a little Mario, a little Metroid, it's very Nintendo focused. It's got that very, very well-defined pixel graphic style. And immediately charming as soon as you boot it up. I would even say the audio design and music composition from the get-go grabs you.
Yeah.
There's this weird, which presses all my buttons, is there's this sort of it has obviously this sort of MIDI-esque kind of undertones to the music and the audio design, but there's this sort of darkness with it, or unsettling. Something isn't right, from the beginning, even when you press the button to kind of like load your game. And the sort of like the 3-dimensional aspect of it, and the way that they have turned the concept of 3D into, I was going to say like a philosophical topic. I don't know. It's like, it's not that. But anyway, you start off and you're Gomez, and he is in his room, and then Gomez, is asked to come to the top of the village, which is a kind of a vertical village. You meet this old guy. I think his name's Geezer.
His name is in fact Geezer.
And
Yep.
he's got an eye patch.
Yep.
And I think there's a story there someplace because he talks about it later. Um, anyway, and he says it's time for adventure or something. I don't remember exactly what he says, but it's fairly memorable. Kind of like, or not memorable in the exact, but just like he's very vague, but also they kind of talk in a weird way. I think intentionally.
Yeah.
Like they switch some of the sentence structure and stuff. But anyway, yeah. So he presents you with a cube. It talks about like nobody in the village thinks that the world is 3-dimensional, and then you're given this Fez that I think the Fez is doing it allows you to now basically rotate this 2-dimensional world on its axes. Four-sided basically axes to the 3-dimensional. So it's blows my mind. I can't imagine what it would be like if you knew nothing about this game, which I've just spoiled it for you. So if you haven't played this game and didn't know what it did, you now know, and it's spoiled.
Yeah.
But I kind of
the spoilers are kind of not a thing we worry about on this
on this podcast. Yeah. But I guess, but no, that's fair. But the thing, what was another recent example of something where, there's an upcoming example that I know of a game that I'm going to start streaming that I don't know very much about, and that's Outer Wilds.
Oh,
and
wow.
actually, I had a request from somebody to say, no, you need to stream that. Don't play it, stream it. And I was like, okay, I'll do, because they wanted. So I don't know why. I still don't know why. Like, I know there's something weird about that game, but
that's going to be interesting. That is I look forward to watching it. But also, it might not be great stream material because I think there's going to be a lot of time where you're like, now what do I do? Because there's a lot of thinking in that game.
They claim that they love watching other people play.
Yeah, I think because they like to see people.
Yeah. Anyway,
try to figure it out. But yeah.
But I bring it up only in that with Fez, and it's same thing with film or books or whatever, right? Where you're like, there is something like I See Dead People. Spoiler, he's dead. That moment is really an important moment,
Yeah.
And I kind of like wish I hadn't known that was the case in Fez, because as soon as you turn it, which it does happen fairly quickly. So
yeah, it happens very quick. In fact, the game reboots.
Yeah, that's right. So good.
So it's basically you go up to the top and Geezer's like, hey, I'm gonna give you this magical Fez, and you're gonna see the way reality really is. And he puts on the hat, and the screen starts glitching out, and you're like, uh-oh. And it like reboots as if you just hit the little reset button on your Nintendo, and it just restarts and shows you the initial thing that you saw in the first place. The boot up. There's like a BIOS type.
No, there's there's like a BIOS boot up, but that wasn't in the first time. Right. This is
correct.
Just this time. Yeah, very clever.
As if you had rebooted your whole machine, right? But it goes straight into the game again, and now you can turn the world. Like suddenly you can just at the touch of the shoulder button, the world will turn. I don't know too much about how this is achieved, from a technical perspective. I remember at the time, Renaud Bedard, who was the programmer, and I think contributed to the design. I think anybody who kind of worked on it did. He talked about how difficult it was to achieve this, to make it look the way it looks, which is really, it's hard to really describe, because you'll say, well, you rotate on an axis, but it isn't like that because you don't have perspective.
Yeah, it's not a real 3D.
Right. It's not a 3D environment like we think of them in most games, where you've got this virtual camera in a place that behaves like a camera, in terms of how, or your eye, like in that you see perspective in the distance. What you're presented with here is like a flat plane, like as if it's a 2D game. It's just that you can rotate that 2D game around, the up axis, the up down axis, and see the four sides. Everything is cubes. And he described it as, I guess, Trixels. It's the Trixel engine, which are like a voxel in terms of how they occupy space. But he's doing some pretty wild stuff to make it look as flat as it does. And in the transitions, it's clear that it's rotating.
Yeah,
But at
that's
the
the
same
key.
time, it's not rotating like you'd rotate just a box in a 3D modeling program. It doesn't look like that would look. It maintains its flatness through that rotation, and that is hard to make that look consistent and sane. And to this day, I don't really understand what's being done there to make that happen. It can't be a straight orthographic projection because when it turns, it can't be like, and there's parts where I'm looking at it where I'm like, I almost think I get it, like what is happening, but I just can't quite.
It's mind bending.
It really
Yeah.
is. It's just like this is not how things should look to rotate in space, you know, both as, just as a human person, perceiving the world. There's like, that's not how things look like when they rotate. But also me as a guy who has done some graphics programming in my history, like goes and's like, yeah, that's not how the math works. Like, so there's a lot of, I
It's
just want to say,
smoking.
yeah, it's more than smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of math involved to actually make it look consistent and right. And like that because he built a tool to be able to author, this content, as well. And it's a whole thing. So
Interesting. Yeah, I
yeah.
can imagine. I can't imagine how you author levels like that. I mean, because the levels already are pretty complex, and I'm sure they get even worse.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Or better.
yeah, or better. Yeah, but they get even cooler. Yeah, it reminds me. So a game that says probably influence, which I'm pretty confident they even mention in let me see here in the wiki. Uh, yeah. Which I have played, which was Monument Valley.
Oh, of course.
Um,
Yeah.
Using the kind of like this kind of there's a similar motif in using the the perception of the player, right? But that's a more Escher-esque
Right.
isometric kind
Right.
of trickery. But it's similar to isometric, games even from the past. I would say is that truly isometric games, which we did play, one being XCOM.
Mm-hmm.
There's like, because it's not in perspective like the real world, there is isometric games always gave me this sort of optical illusion feeling, where it's like something isn't right, but I know the math is correct, because it's just lines that all line up, but it's like obviously the environment is flat and looks very isometric and doesn't look right because it's not in perspective. So it's always like kind of broke my brain a little bit, because it's like, yeah, this is clearly a computer generated thing. And so I only bring that up, and I'm trying to describe, because like, for instance, if you look at the top of a tree in this game, as it turns, there's this weird warping and optical illusion that happens because it's kind of foreshortening the perspective as it's turning, and the transitions there, and then it becomes flat again as it finishes the transition. But
Yeah.
it, like the pixels even kind of look like they're bending a little bit if you pay attention, because of the optical illusion. So
Yeah.
it is, and I think that it would be accurate in, if you were to sort of draw this, I guess, to put it in another context, the same way that Escher did. But anyway, yeah, I don't even know what to say about it so far. I'm just like, I it's overwhelming. I have to just kind of like, one of the notes I wrote down. Actually, I just looking at my very long list of notes, I wrote down twice because I guess I forgot I wrote it down and then had it come to me again. This is a game that you really have to. My perception so far is that this is a game that you really have to just trust,
Yeah.
and that is, I think, a staple of puzzle games anyway. In that you're like, this doesn't look like I'm going to be able to do this, but you just have to keep going.
Yeah.
And eventually, if you trust the game, and because of the reputation of this game, I assume it's, people have finished it before. It is solvable,
Yes. And it can be
So
solved without help of the internet. I know sometimes you get stuck and we're doing things on a on a timeline, but
yeah, timeline's the biggest problem.
I think though it's honestly worth it. I would rather you play less of it for the podcast and
Yeah,
experience the game without help,
yeah.
because the the
Oh yeah,
times
no, I
there's
will.
some just joyous moments when I connect some dots and go, "Oh my god." And I'm like, "Oh my god, I have to go through the whole game again because I've just realized something and I know it's been there the whole time and now I understand,
Oh,
I have like a new lens on the game that I now have to go back through the game to like apply the lens everywhere I can think to apply it." There are moments like that in this game
wow.
where I just go, "Oh my god, I have to go through the whole thing again," and I'm happy. I'm like overjoyed, that I get to go and like figure out all these things, because I've understood some key aspect of like what the what the I don't know what the it sounds so like minimal to say what the puzzle is, but it is, because it's more than that. It's more of like a way of viewing the world, really, that is
Hmm.
kind of inherent to this style of design. And the other thing too is, and we maybe need to talk about this a little bit in the context of the indies. One of the things that the indies of this time could achieve was, look, it's 5 people. Some of those weren't even full time. They were like, they did the animation or some artwork or whatever. And I think Phil Fish did a lot of the art, and then people helped him with the pixel animation, the animations with pixel art. um and Renault was doing the engine work, pretty hard. It's a 5-year development, but it's not a lot of people, so they could really take their time everywhere to think like, what what is this part of it about, and to just infuse an ethos throughout the whole thing. And that's really hard to do. First of all, the larger teams get, because it's just hard to communicate that vision clearly everywhere, across everybody, especially nowadays when, studios in multiple places. Um, but even back then, for, teams that were like 100 people, it's hard to have a consistent one vision across 100 people or 200 people, or we mentioned Assassin's Creed 3, 1,000 people or whatever it was, by the time they got to Assassin's Creed 3. um, it's hard to have one consistent vision, but one creator, one or two creators can. um, and that, I think, is, I feel like this game is a almost a palimpsest of itself, of like the
Mm,
layers that are on it, are like, oh, they probably did the same thing building it as I'm describing, of like, oh, we could do this. Oh, well, we should do it everywhere. This should be everywhere. This should be part of the fabric of the whole game. I think that's part of why it took so long, to build it. It wasn't actually I mean, sure, every level had to be meticulously constructed around certain sort of rules that they had in their head and how the thing will progress. Um, but also, I think like there are moments where they're like, oh, we should do this. Okay, but if we do that, we have to like, that's going to be a revelation that somebody's going to get at some point, and so it has to like be something they had been seeing, then they don't realize they've been seeing, that sort of
mhm.
thing. I'm trying
Yeah,
to be vague, but like
yeah,
talk about like the whole ethos that I think started to set these games apart, because and we'll talk about the influences, but even though it was based on these kind of older games, they went to it, they were like, okay, yeah, but somebody already figured out the language of those games. What if we told a different kind of story
yeah.
with it? So
The other note I wrote down a couple times, or various versions of, was just subversion.
yeah.
Like there's a sense of subversion for me, at least so far, of like they are intentionally trying as developers, especially with the influences that they've had as gamers, to subvert expectations, of course, even in the story of the game, what little there is so far, and subverting the influences that they had too, which yeah, we'll talk about in a second. Um, but uh, yeah, it's the to your point about like the team size and the more sort of vision focused small teams and what they are able to do. And I don't want to poke, obviously we don't know. I don't know how they were funded or how they were paying the bills, so to speak, but and I don't mean to focus on budget so much, but when budgets for these big games, we're talking about these big sequels, become as high as they are, and the teams are so big. Obviously, this is something that I experienced many times over the years, time and time again. The concept of any creative vision that is proposed, right, goes through a rigorous process at these big corporations to ensure that it is at the perception of the executives or perception of leadership, I'll say, which is various people, right? That it is within the right bounds of what the money should be spent on, which is, in many cases, 8 digits or more. Eight, is that right? Yeah, 8 digits
Yeah.
or more. And so the concept of doing something fresh and different and unique, which I definitely have hit multiple times in my career, is not usually greenlit, because it's just too risky, And when you're in an indie space like this, it seems like, not having completely been in that space before, that it's like, yes, you have to your point, you have fewer people to get on board, but also you're defining the risk. You're not getting an approval. Yes, you have to eventually go out and pitch probably the playable, but you probably have a playable, and it already has proven itself, blah, blah, blah. So you're kind of already past that point of you greenlit yourself, and you just have a vision and you're sticking to it, you know, um, everything else be damned. And the ones that resonate with people will get published eventually. Um, so,
Or self-published,
or
as
self-published,
we
yeah.
say. Yeah.
You could totally, yeah. I mean, that's another road. I mean, this one publishing wise, I think I don't even know who Trapdoor is, but I assume it's a very
Oh,
small.
I think that I should have looked that up, but I think my recollection is the Trapdoor.
Oh, it was founded by Ken
Schachter,
Schachter, yeah. Who was also a French Canadian, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was not.
It was a
Yeah,
small publisher, right? And my point is
very
that it's
small publisher. I mean, it was sort of like, so there was also like indie quote unquote publishing, which was really just like, we'll fill out the forms so you don't have to, and they weren't doing a lot for their for them, but
it
that's true.
wasn't the same, yeah. It
Yeah,
wasn't the
very
same.
very much not a sort of traditional publisher model. It was more like, we'll keep track of a schedule of events that we can get you into, because indie events, were a big deal. I mean, that's part of Indie Games the Movie, is like being at the Penny Arcade one. I think it was like a big deal because I think that's the first time it was kind of shown publicly. Um, in the film, like people were seeing it for the first time, and he was terrified. It was kind of it's quite a, it's quite. There's some real moments in that movie. Yeah, so I guess it did have a publisher, but like you look at the history of Trapdoor, and it's like, well, they had 2 shipped games. That's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
what
no,
you
that's
normally.
not.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, the indie publisher is another good topic related to this too. That
yeah.
sometimes people would self-publish, or oftentimes they do, but sometimes there's also these basically like indie publishers who help you get it to come to market, but to go to
or
market.
even do a little production help. Often is part of it too. Is that one of the things that the indies weren't typically very good about was like figuring out their schedule and shipping on it. So there was kind of also a cottage industry of like producers who were not
Yeah.
at a particular company, but were like either independent or were on the publisher side and just helping with that, so that the
Mm-hmm.
publisher would know this game's going to be able to come out at such and such a date, so that they could be starting to put together things like, hey, do is there going to be a demo, and start asking questions like that. So yeah, it's a whole thing. But yeah, the other company I saw associated with something like Bitworks or Blitworks or something like that that had actually ported it to the PlayStation infrastructure. So that's what I'm seeing, but you're probably not, because you're playing it on Switch. So I think it was,
Hmm.
not, they didn't really have to port it for you, because the Xbox 360 was mostly a PC. With some specific hardware. So anyway, just worth noting.
Yeah, I'm looking at the platforms wise, it was on almost everything.
Yeah, it's been everywhere, even
Although
iOS.
not some of the more modern Xboxes, which is interesting. At least it's not listed, so I wonder what that is
Yeah,
about.
who knows? I mean, the perception might have been that it just wasn't viable there, or maybe it was still just on live and it just ran on those, and so it's not sort of separately published there. That could also be with the
Oh yeah,
going
yeah,
from
that
the
could be.
360 to one, is once it's on Xbox Live, it just keeps running, going forward. Might be the theory. I don't know. I don't know if you could play it on an Xbox One X or something like that these days, but anyway. Yeah, so you went further than I did. I only got a couple of cubes because it was mostly tutorial at the beginning. And it starts to, we should probably just like wind down by talking about its influences, because they're all pretty evident. Well, two of them are very evident at the very beginning, and the third, I think, becomes pretty clear by the time you look at the map, to some degree. Like, you start to understand the third major influence, and they're all Nintendo titles. So you want to go ahead and tackle those?
Yeah, I mean, it's again with I think a subversive lens on things. There,
Yeah.
Zelda, Mario, and then eventually, I guess, Metroid, which I can imagine what you mean by that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's part of that,
Looking
like looking at the world with a new lens. It's just
right,
not quite the
right,
same type
right.
of lens
I
as
noticed in the
Metroid.
inventory there's a section for something called artifacts, which I assume are going to be kind of mutate your perception on things. Yeah, but like the chests are very Zelda, right?
Yeah, you
The
even
sort
get
of
a musical piece that's very like da 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 da
yeah,
da da. It's
yeah,
not quite that, but you hear it and you're like, this person has heard the Zelda chest opening song before. There's
yeah.
definitely a feel there.
Yeah, and then obviously the platforming part of it, but the puzzle part of it is an interesting one because I mean, I guess older Zeldas had sort of puzzles, but it's like those are the influences, but the depth of puzzles even, and I'm sure obviously it goes further and further with this, but I can only imagine how like I'm unraveling there's sort of like a graveyard level that I guess the best description I can. There's like ghosts and stuff. Um, the complexity of that kind of stuff is not very Nintendo, or I guess Paper Mario or something like that. There's other games that might have stuff like this, but I feel like they have their influences, but they also have another thing they're trying to do. But the fourth influence, that there's actually a room someplace that I found where there was like a chalkboard or something, or some sort of, no, it was like a science room, like a sciencey laboratory room, and there was a diagram on the wall, and it literally had the Tetris pieces on it.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh yeah, I can see Tetris being an influence to this game in a weird way. Like not directly, but the spirit of shape language and putting things, even the language that it seems like there's actually a language in the game that they have iconography for that looks like Tetris pieces or something. So they have, it's just this concept of for me, I start extending it into places like, okay, they're trying to say that this two-dimensional world doesn't realize that there's three dimensions, and then there's this sort of like logical progression there of, oh yeah, we live in three dimensions, but what is the fourth dimension? That kind of I
Yeah.
love that stuff, where science fiction pushes you. Yeah, I don't know. And then the whole glitching kind of thing where it's like self-aware that it's a program, which I'm also playing Axiom Verge finally.
Yeah.
And there's
Another
some
one
of
that
that.
has a very
Yeah.
that, also pulls primarily Metroid in that one,
Metroid for
but
sure. Yeah.
also the early Nintendo games, where the
Yeah.
sort of and I feel like there's even Nintendo, like there's a part of those games where the discovery, you're always like, am I discovering something that's meant to happen? It's like in those early days. And this one is specifically, the Axiom Verge is specifically like adding in glitch aesthetics. I never played the sequel, but I did play the original. Um,
Yeah,
the
you're
sequel,
kind of, it's got a Tron thing going, right? Where
yeah,
you're, or even like Out of This World, which we played, right? Where
yeah,
you're kind of brought into the program. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
The
Yes.
scientist.
Yeah, it's a whole that was a good one too. I enjoyed that. I played that probably might have been a little later. I don't think it was out at the time that I was playing a lot of this stuff, but maybe only a couple of years later. And I did play it not too long after it came out. Um yeah, so it's definitely, it's got, they the like I said before, there's kind of like we want to use the language of these games that everybody understands and that they grew up playing and they loved. And this was also true of Braid and Super Meat Boy, where they were specifically about the platforming entirely. Super Meat Boy is like, okay, what if we took, SMB, like it's
Yeah.
clearly what it is, right? But what if we turned the speed and craziness up to a million, not just to 11, but just like the difficulty and like the um just the control, that you find, like the example with Super Meat Boy feels like, in a Super Mario Brothers game, you have all the abilities at the beginning. You got to kind of figure them out, and like you can do all the jumps and stuff. It can all be very precise. Um, and it sort of says, okay, what if we did that, but at like 1,000 miles an hour, and every time your guy died, which is going to happen all the time, you got to instantly, play the level, like immediately, like you just start again, and in fact, the blood is often left behind from your meat boy. Um, and then of course, Braid's whole thing was, designing everything around like everything about the visual language and the theming of it with its time mechanic, which was the thing that it added, was gonna all tie together, you know, in a way that the creator found was profound. You know, players may differ, but Fez, I think, is doing the same thing with with similar, precedents, which are those sort of three classic Nintendo, you know, franchises, and moment to moment, you don't have the sort of run and keep the speed going like you do in a Mario game. It kind of has a more methodical pace, like you might think of as Zelda, or I guess to some degree Metroid, because you are stopping and like figuring out how you're going to get somewhere, and you're turning the world around. Like it can't go at the pace of Super Mario. Um, but it's using a lot of the mechanics from all three, and kind of the world structure. um, when I pulled back to look at the map, I was like, oh yeah, this is like the Metroid Prime map. Not exactly, but like that kind
Yeah.
of
The three dimensional.
the three dimensionality, but also, it's more abstract, and it's like all these cubes attached to other cubes. But it
It's a
also
very
reminded,
interesting map.
yeah, it's a cool map, and it made me think of the Metroid Prime one, and like how when I was playing that game, it like I was like, oh man, like the way, and other stuff about it, actually, the interface generally with Super Metroid, like where you could go and look at the lore in the sort of dictionary it had, also kind of had that feel. So it like felt like it was influenced by a lot of Nintendo stuff. And I think the Metroid stuff will become more clear as time goes by. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, yeah, I just, it just, I think it's really interesting to talk about influences because, like I said at the top, the sort of case study of how how those classic games have been able to unearth these, potentially masterpieces or what have you, right? These, like you seem to be a big fan of it. And the, I mean, as far as the circular element of it, wasn't there a Mario game where you could rotate the world that came out later that was like on 3DS or something? I feel like there was a
There
Fez
was
Mario game.
there was a Mario game where you could it
Not being a Mario fan, I don't
might have been
know.
on the 3DS, but where you could slip through. I
Well,
think it
there's
was
Paper Mario, right? That
well, it wasn't Paper Mario though. What was that one called? I don't think I played it. It was the one that was on the 3DS.
yeah, yeah.
And you could slip back through the world. I'm trying to look it up because I don't
But it
remember.
had like this that kind of the
It did
road
kind of have the feel of like,
you were going
I mean, Paper
around.
Mario has that a little
Oh
bit,
yeah, it's
but
a puzzly.
but
It's
it was
called
oh
yeah. It was
god, I wish I could remember.
Toad. Oh, is it the Toad one?
No,
Anyway,
no,
people are
that
yelling at us
yeah, I
right
know.
now.
I'm not like the crazy Mario guy either. It wasn't this one. I'm looking at a list here, um, so I can
Anyway,
find it. There were too many Mario games. There were too many Mario games. He
oh,
said.
that's for sure. Yeah, but it's just funny how that that there's a. I think there's a strong chance that Fez had an influence on. But I will say in our final moments here, it made sense that this would happen, but and again, sort of the way that they're rendering the world, especially in the transitions that we talked about before, is what kind of breaks my brain even more because of what I'm about to talk about. Is there's a sense of the character position that is maintained in the world after you rotate.
Right.
So, which I don't think would be maybe necessarily obvious to people. Like it, I don't even. It's so funny how I guess we are doing a podcast about video games, where video games are about playing them, and
Yeah.
so describing them is never easy. But this one is almost indescribable as far as like if you were to try to tell somebody how the game plays, I don't know if you could really get it through to them because the camera is always the camera, right? It's very two-dimensional static. And the character, I kind of did a little bit of a test last night, doesn't move very far from the center of the screen almost ever, right? The world is what's moving. If you there's like a I don't know, there's some margin there, but it's like as soon as you get to a certain point, you're not the camera's going to shift with you. But when you rotate the world, Gomez maintains his position like um
Like his
his
XY
two-dimensional
his
position,
XY
right?
plotted position. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But the world now has shifted. So the platform you were standing on, or no, there may not be a platform that you are now standing on based on where you were before because the world has shifted. But sometimes there is because you're now behind it and they actually show a silhouette of him, etc. But then, as I anticipated, which is obviously you would do this, you can kind of like they actually have some really good, I think, clever pixel animation with him because he can kind of like crawl around corners sometimes and
Right.
like up on
Kind of
ledges.
scoot around them. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's still this sense of three dimensionality, even though it's two dimensional, and like you can crawl on the side of like a vines on a side, so you're just looking at it on its side, on the edge. But then if you jump, when you spin, he doesn't drop.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
Time is paused for him.
so exactly,
Yeah. While
exactly.
you're
And
yeah.
that is also a very critical design decision. And as soon as you know that works, it's just like your mind's blown all over again. And I'm sure my mind's going to be blown many more times playing the game. But there's a sort of of course that's how it works, and I just tested it out in one of the rooms. I jumped up and just kept spinning and he just stays there,
Yep. Yep.
and then jumping and then spinning and landing on the platform that is now there because you spun it,
Yeah.
that wasn't there before. That's like, okay, now I'm not even sure how I can platform in this game anymore because of that. So it's yeah, it is something else.
Yeah.
It is something
There will
else.
definitely be times where that comes into play where you're you're jumping to something that isn't there until you're in the air and you've spun the world for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I've
Um,
already done it. I've
yeah,
already done it.
you've already done
Yeah.
it. It
Yeah.
happens pretty early, but like, um, yeah, there's a lot to come. It's just so this game's
But
super.
once you have, yeah, and I'm sure there is. You keep alluding to like all these other aha moments. But the thing that I love about the game so far is that you can see that there's these fundamental, wherever the idea came from, Phil, whomever, you can see that there's these fundamental concepts that they nailed and they understood very quickly, or not quickly, but they understood very purely, I'll say.
Yes, yeah,
And
yeah,
once you have those concepts, so many things will come from it, right? Because there's like, of course, this, and then of course that, and then of course this, and these fundamental concepts, and that's when we talk about the merger of level design and systems design, and how those when those the best games are when they work together,
yeah,
because they feed off of each other. You can see, and of course, if Phil did most of both of those, maybe.
yeah, yeah. He did.
Then that helps. But yeah, it is kind of a thing that seems hard to keep in your head. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Keep it all straight.
yeah. I can't imagine like editing these levels. I mean, I think probably what you're doing is looking at the four directions simultaneously. Like you have four windows that are the four views, and you're like, when you're
Mm,
painting in one, you're seeing it update everywhere, so that you actually can figure out how this is going to work. um so that, like, what Tim is describing is like you'll jump. You're standing on a platform that is, as it turns out, it's like a um it's not, is obviously it's not a 2D platform, it's a 3D platform in space. It's probably a square or something like that. Not a cube, but like a square and one like cube deep, in a sort of Minecraft sense. And then, so like 3 by 3 but one deep, in a Minecraft sense. And then you turn and you're still on that, but now a platform that was um not accessible to you now comes over and is next to you, because you just turned it around the axis of the world, and it's like over next to you, and now you can get a little bit higher, and then you turn again, and now you can jump to this other thing, or you can jump up to the main mass of the level or whatever. Those are the kind of things that are happening. This is for people who haven't played. It's like, oh, I got to this, well, I don't have anywhere I can jump to. Well, if I rotate the world, now I can
yeah.
jump to this other place, that in a traditional platformer is nowhere near it, but in this kind of weird world that has, been designed here, is just a click away, or a shoulder button away. So yeah, it's super, super fun game. I'm looking forward to discussing more of it with you. I do, since we're past an hour, I think we should wind down now here, but I do want to read one email that we got, which
Okay.
talked about our last uh, series, so called. Let's see here. This is from Sam. The subject is 1997. This was sent to devgameclub@gmail.com. He says, hearing Tim's experience of Interstate 76 fills me with nostalgia for a better time. Asking mom to drive me to Circuit City to get a computer game, my imagination going wild on the long ride home, perusing the manual during a 45-minute install, the game failing to run, dozens of hours reinstalling, troubleshooting, hunting for patches, Circuit City refusing a refund due to an open box. Those were the days, says Sam. So you kind of experienced that with our last game, unfortunately.
Yeah.
A little bit tricky for you. Sorry, I don't know what to say other than I wish we had
Yeah.
known.
Yeah. Yeah. I am still trickling a little bit in the emulation direction to see if I can unearth something there. No promises, but my motivation there is for Interstate 76. So we'll see if I can figure any of that out. I know PC emulation is even weirder, probably beast, but um, yeah, it is. I mean, Sam, I share those stories of other games, not
Yeah,
Interstate 76, but those the same thing of like there was always an anxiety to it for me too of like, okay, because they weren't cheap, and and I knew there always was a chance that it wasn't going to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Luckily, a lot of the bigger companies had their own customer service, but still, like, it's not a fun process back then. And I was primarily a PC gamer, so those old x86 machines and getting into DOS and looking at batch files and
trying to find a way to get the extended memory or whatever.
Oh, the memory, yeah,
the memory was a whole thing.
What was what was that file? Was it any file? Where were you?
That was
I remember, reserving memory for certain, like allocating memory.
Yeah, there was like an expanded memory mode or something like that, but you had to install essentially a driver.
There was some place, like some DOS file, I felt like, where I was putting in numbers.
Config.CFG.
Yeah.
I think it was .CFG. I was like, but I don't. God, it's been so long since I had to deal with that. And actually, I didn't do a ton of that, honestly, because I kind of, as I've talked about before, I have a long gap from like playing on like the Apple II and Mac, the early Mac. And then having a 386, and like I did not, play a lot of games in the kind of interim of that. So it's I missed kind of the worst, hardest core of that stuff. And I don't feel the worst for it, to be honest. Anyway, thanks for that email, Sam. The nostalgia of times past. You can send us email, as I mentioned, as Sam did, at devgameclub@gmail.com. We're also now accepting reviews. That's new. I don't know if you know that, Tim. We're starting to accept reviews now. So if people want to do that through the iOS infrastructure or something like that, we don't really, advertise this podcast in any way. So your reviews are the only way that we let people know. And I wanted to mention again that we're on YouTube. We have tripled our listenership on YouTube. So we have 3 people, as far as I can tell, listening on YouTube. Congrats. Welcome. I guess it's a thing. I don't know.
It came up in my feed.
Did it? Well,
I was scrolling because I do actually watch a lot of YouTube.
Oh, I don't. I don't open YouTube
for entertainment. And it came up. I was
maybe not exactly the target audience. Anyway, we're also on the web at devgameclub.com, and my co-host here, Twitch, is at twitch.tv/
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end. If you're listening to this Wednesday when it comes out, there's a strong chance that we're doing a group Minecraft dungeon crawl or something. Lost Lake, Moors, and others. I think even Kaon is in there. Mystery Dip. Like, I don't know what they're doing in there. I haven't been in a while, and I should probably try to jump in before this. But yeah, I think we might do some sort of like group adventure on stream tomorrow. So
I hope you have a good time. I'm still paying for it.
Thank you.
So enjoy and discuss. Watch that or discuss it on the Discord. There's a link to that as well in the show notes. Our intro and outro music was written and performed by Kirk Hamilton, commissioned by friend of the cast Aaron Evers, and our logo, that Discord, our merch store, all by Mark Garcia. Have fun playing with your devil squares this week, and good night.
Good night.